Hi, welcome to With Liberty and Justice for Some. I'm Mark Pocan. The National Institutes of Health has led to the creation of almost every single prescription drug that we use in this country. It's helped cure diseases. It's helped map the human genome. It's one of the biggest scientific heavyweights on the planet, helping us to move forward as a society, as people. And all of this is under attack right now with Donald Trump as he fires people, blocks funding, and creates general chaos as we're trying to continue moving forward with the nation's health. Well, today my guest is the former head of the NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, who served under 3 different presidents, Democratic and Republican, and spoke with me about what it means for future medical advancements by continuing to invest and protect the NIH. But before we hear from him, we have a 1 minute with the Wisconsin Attorney General, Josh Kaul. Josh, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So we have one question for you. And the question is, if you had special powers, and almost like Donald Trump thinks he has, but if you actually, we somehow granted that you could change any federal law that's out there, what would that one federal law that you would want to change, what would that be?
Oh man, that's a great question, Mark. You know, you're the expert on federal laws here, so I'm now fascinated to know what your answer is. Maybe you can tell me what your answer is, and I'll give you a good answer and response.
Well, yeah, I think the one I've heard that comes up a lot, and I really do believe it's very central, is campaign finance reform. You know, until we fix End Citizens United and things like that, every issue comes back to, outside moneyed interests. I mean, Elon Musk would just be another Yahoo, who's living off the government teat. Instead, he's got the ability to turn on and off the federal spigots simply because of issues like that. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And one thing that has certainly been a frustration for I think a lot of us is the way that the filibuster has been abused to block progress from being made on so many issues that have broad support from people across the board. But I certainly think campaign finance is a key area. I think that's a really great answer. And I also think making sure that some of these programs that are being slashed right now by DOJ, here's an answer that's very specific to the moment. Making sure that Congress is able to exercise its ability to have its laws be enforced by the executive branch would be really key. Now, I would argue that the Constitution provides us that protection, but we certainly can't allow a system where the White House is able to essentially disregard acts of Congress or to pretend like they don't exist, because at that point, Congress is losing its core function. It's spending powers with Congress, and allowing Donald Trump to block that is just unacceptable. So making sure that the federal government complies with Congress, that might not be an answer I would have given you 3 or 4 months ago,
right.
But right now it would be critically important.
Yeah, the problem is all these Republicans who carry little pocket guides of the Constitution, they can't read it if it's in their pocket. Sometimes they got to take it out, crack it open, look at Article 1, see what the power of Congress is, and maybe would have some people stand up. But at least in the meantime, we've got people like Josh Kaul standing up for people in Wisconsin and across the country. So, Josh, thanks so much for being with us today. One of the greatest pleasures I've had in Congress is to serve on the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee is the committee that, not surprisingly, appropriates or provides money for the spending that we do in Congress. And to me, the best way you show your values, your priorities as a nation is where we invest those tax dollars. And research to cure diseases is absolutely one of those priorities. And for a while, it was a bipartisan priority. As a society, we progress through research, and no one did it better than the United States. And that's something that we all should be proud of. One of the leading institutions that fosters research is the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, and they spend about $48 billion annually to make us live longer and better through scientific research, at least potentially until now. Part of the disabling of our federal government by Donald Trump and Elon Musk has also hit the NIH, and that can cause way more problems than may appear on the surface. It's not just cutting new research, it's literally wasting millions of dollars of ongoing research by its sledgehammer approach to cuts, potentially putting years of previous research to waste as well. And one of the best parts of my job was getting to ask questions of some of the very best, the smartest people in the nation when it comes to things like research, including people at the NIH. And one of my absolute favorites, and I really mean this, Dr. Collins, one of my absolute favorites was Dr. Francis Collins, the former head of the NIH from 2009 to 2021, served under 3 presidents from both political parties. Prior to that, he was appointed director. Before he was appointed the director of the NIH, Dr. Collins led the Human Genome Project and other genomics research initiatives as the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, which is one of the 27 institutes and centers at the NIH. And today I get one more chance to ask questions of someone who truly is a national hero on behalf of his work for this nation's health, Dr. Francis Collins. Dr. Collins, thank you for being a part of the program today.
Well, Congressman, it's a pleasure to have a chance to have this kind of a conversation instead of the ones that we had in the past where you were sitting on the dais and I was at the witness table wondering what was going to get thrown at me from one member or the other. But I always knew when you asked a question, it was going to be well informed, it was going to be interesting, it was going to be something that we could all really enjoy digging into a little bit to try to figure out, because I could tell always that you had really learned a lot about medical research and its benefits for America. And you wanted to be sure that we were doing everything we could to optimize that. And I always liked those conversations a lot. So glad to join you now in a somewhat different way. Now, as I'm a private citizen after 32 years at NIH, I retired on February 28th. And I would say that was not entirely of my own decision making. It was something that became impossible to stay longer. And we're probably going to talk a little bit about some of the things that have made life really challenging for people at NIH in the last 2.5 months.
Yeah, well, let's start just to kind of explaining NIH a little bit to people, right?
Sure.
I know that NIH awards more than 60,000 grants in support of something like 300,000 researchers across 2,500 different institutions. I mean, this really has a huge national impact. Just in fiscal year 23, NIH funding supported more than 410,000 jobs, with about 7,800 of those jobs in Wisconsin, in my home state, for about $1.1 billion. And in that same year, NIH funded research fueled nearly $93 billion in economic spending nationwide. So let's just start in the simplest way. What is the National Institutes of Health and why should people care?
It is the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world. It's been around for more than 100 years. It is the way in which the US government has provided resources to institutions all over the country to support the best and brightest and most visionary scientists to make discoveries that are going to change things for the better as far as reducing suffering and prolonging not just lifespan, but health span. A better chance for all of us to live out a full and complete life and not have that interrupted or interfered with by illness. And the track record is pretty astounding, although maybe we have short memories, but lifespan in the US has gone up about twofold since 100 years ago. Deaths from heart attack and stroke are down now by about 70% over what they were just a couple of decades ago. Cancer deaths are dropping every year. We're down now about 30% from where they were just 25 years ago. Diseases like HIV/AIDS, which was universally fatal back in the 1980s and early 90s, are now consistent with essentially a normal lifespan if you have access to the drugs that were developed by NIH in partnership with industry. And diseases like cystic fibrosis, which disease my own lab worked on intensively. Now we know what the cause is, and there are therapies that allow those folks who used to be lucky to make it to age 20 or 25 to now start planning for retirement. So the track record is just amazing, and the science is amazing. And it's part of this American ecosystem of medical research, which is unlike anything the rest of the world has been able to achieve, where you have the government supporting through these universities primarily doing the research and the grants that are highly competitive and peer reviewed, this basic science that leads to some new insight that then needs to get translated a little bit into something that might be clinically relevant. And then industry, if it looks like it's going to be something that the public would benefit from, industry picks it up and takes it off to become a device or a drug or some other product. And it has been, some would say, the strongest supporter of our economy since the real ecosystem kicked in 20 or 30 years ago. And America has absolutely outshone every other country in the world in the success of this. And it's because of these partners and how they work together. So, and for you as somebody overseeing appropriations there in that Labor H subcommittee of the appropriations process, obviously this was something of great interest.
Yeah.
But I think you'd agree, Congressman, that as long as it was being handled in the most efficient way, and that was always a good question, the track record for both saving lives and stimulating the economy was pretty hard to beat.
Yeah.
That's
No.
where we are.
Yeah. As I've said before, I mean, I thought this was one of those areas that was bulletproof, right? That both Republicans and Democrats saw the value for. In fact, when the Republicans were in charge of the budget, they were pretty kind still to NIH.
They were.
Yet some of that has changed. We'll come to that in a second. But on the research, I mean, some of the stuff is really groundbreaking that NIH has been a part of. Can you give just an example or two of something that, the average person might not know, but has been really a huge improvement because of that research with help from the NIH?
Well, sure. Cancer is a place we should look to right now because so many exciting things are happening in that space. We figured out because of the Human Genome Project that we could actually look at every individual cancer and ask, what's happened there? What misspellings in the DNA instruction book have caused those cells to grow when they weren't supposed to? And could you actually use that information to choose a better therapy instead of the one size, instead of the carpet bombing that was sort of the case with chemotherapy, do something more specific? And now with immunotherapy, which has become so amazingly successful in the last few years, we have people with stage 4 disease who are getting cured.
Wow.
Because you get the immune system to wake up and discover those cancer cells that they had kind of missed noticing, and then get them going there and go after. So your own body is basically curing yourself. It just needs to be taken to graduate school to recognize what was missing there and get a little help. So this is just a phenomenal time for cancer research. And we all need that, of course. This is still a disease many people are appropriately worried about. I'm a cancer survivor myself, and I'm glad that this progress is happening in a little personal way as well as for the whole world.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And we have a great Carbone Cancer Research Facility here at UW-Madison. And I know NIH has been extremely supportive. And, I've gone there with the current director of NIH. And I got to admit, I'm a journalism major. I took physics for poets. I may not be the greatest scientific mind, but when I'd go there and listen to the conversation and what was going on in the research and the progress, man, it is really amazing. And the NIH is right at the core of it. So, and again, you're guiding the agency for so many years doing that. I just can't tell you how much it's made a difference to people in my district's life.
Oh, it was an absolute privilege. The people at NIH are just amazing. As the director, you also have this convening power. If you have an idea about an area that maybe could go to the next level and you're not quite sure it's going to happen without a push, you basically call up some people and say, hey, I'd like to 2 weeks from now have a real brainstorming session with the world's experts to see whether there might be some really bold new project that we could begin to initiate. They all show up because they figure, okay, something's going to happen here. So to have that opportunity as the NIH director is why the job is so amazing. It's not that you yourself have all the answers. No person would. I certainly didn't. But you get to tap into all these other incredible brains and ask them to work together to design something amazing.
Well, I've got to ask you, I think every time you came before, I asked this question. So I feel like I have to ask this again. Is there any drug that you know of that's come to market in the last 20 years that has not had the support of the American people via the NIH?
I do remember you asking
I
that
ask that every
question.
time.
And there's the researcher named Fred Ledley, who has been systematically trying to answer your question and help me answer your
Yes.
question by looking at this. I think his most recent study covered the period from 2012 to 2020, so the
Okay.
sort of recent 8 years. And he looked at 346, if I'm remembering right, of the drugs that FDA had approved in that
Yeah.
period, and said how many of them were based upon NIH research.
Yeah.
Well, it was 345. So it was
Yeah.
all but one.
Yeah. All but
And
one.
people don't know that,
Yeah.
okay, whatever people are listening to this, maybe have in their medicine cabinet, something they take every day or something they take if they need to.
Hmm.
You just kind of assume it happened and it was probably that company that did it. Companies can only get to that point if they had this fundamental science background to build upon. And that's what NIH has done. And that's, again, why America has been so successful in this area.
So help me try to understand that there have been some really recent unprecedented attacks on science. And, it's not just from the new president, but from a large segment of society
Mhm.
really looks at this. Do you have a hypothesis or a possible explanation of why this attack is happening?
I sort of do, but I sort of don't.
Okay.
I guess I've been really worried about this, Congressman, going back over quite a few years, that our society was becoming increasingly polarized,
Hmm.
and that instead of being in a circumstance where we had different opinions, but then we all kind of had a beer together,
Yeah.
we've become more and more in these divided, polarized communities, many of them driven by politics, that everything kind of got folded into.
Hmm.
And science got caught up in that too. And you mix politics and science, and you just get politics. You don't
Yeah.
really have much science visible anymore. And there has been, of course, always a question mark, and there should be in people's minds about whether science can be trusted. But science, if it conducts research in the way that we demand happen with NIH, where you have appropriate experimental controls and you get your data and you make it available and it's peer reviewed and it gets published in a journal, you can be pretty sure most of that's right. And if it's really important, somebody else is going to redo it and see if they get the same answer.
Hmm.
So science builds up what you could call a fundamental set of knowledge that is something you can count on being correct. Now, occasionally, something new comes along. Isaac Newton thought he had everything all figured out about physics, and then quantum mechanics came along, and that's exciting too. Scientists love it when that happens.
Hmm.
But for the most part, if there's something that's been well established, it's in that what Jonathan Rauch calls the constitution of knowledge, then that's something we should count on. And by the way, if you decide something in that space is something you don't like, well, that's sort of too bad. It's
Yeah.
like facts don't care how you feel.
Right.
But as we've gotten more and more polarized and more sort of animosity has crept into things and suspicion, then some facts might be seen by some people as not something that they wanted. And so you might hear people say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me.
Mm.
And if it's really a fact, that's a bad situation.
Right.
So you could start to see some of this happening over certain areas going back, gosh, probably even a few decades. But to be honest, it got so much worse during COVID.
Yeah.
Here was the crisis, the worst pandemic in more than a century, and it
Hmm.
should have drawn us together against this common enemy, this horrible coronavirus. And for a while it did. For the first few months of 2020, we were all kind of doing what we could, clapping and banging pans for the healthcare providers who were coming home after a horrible day at the hospital or the emergency room. But then it was so stressful. The messages coming at people from public health experts, sometimes including me, weren't always ones that maybe were as well explained as they could be.
Hmm.
And a whole lot of conspiracies and other misinformation was getting into people's heads from social media and cable news and sometimes from politicians. And people didn't know who to believe anymore. And maybe our science foundation wasn't as strong as it needed to be. And so, bit by bit, science trust began to slip. And if you look at any of those surveys, it slipped pretty significantly and has not returned back to where it was because of all of the pain and suffering that people went through. And yeah, let's be clear, it was a horrible period. So many people died, over 1 million. So many people lost loved ones.
Yeah.
Jobs were in terrible shape because businesses were closed. Kids were kept out of school in many instances a lot longer than they should have been and are still trying to catch up on their education. It was bad. And it's human nature maybe to try to look for somebody to blame, and maybe science, because it was out there, was on that list of scapegoats. So we're in a tough place right now where the trust in science has not recovered. And a lot of that is in some ways connected to politics. And again, I think anything that is based upon determining truths about nature really shouldn't be political. And to start making it so, it's got to be bad for everybody. But that's in many instances where we are.
And you wrote a book on this recently, right? Road to Wisdom. And I think this is a part of a central theme. What else was that book about for people who might be interested in following it?
Yeah, I felt I had to try to write down something about what I was observing. And it did seem as if, in many ways, we're all trying to be on this road to lead us to making wise decisions, the road to wisdom. But there's so many potholes that get in the way. And sometimes we find we're over against the guardrails, or maybe the guardrails aren't even there. What happened?
Yeah.
And I identified sort of 4 areas that I thought we might have lost our way a bit. One is really, what is truth? Are we committed to the idea there is such a thing as objective truth? I hope so.
Yeah.
And if something is objectively true from science or from history, then it's probably not a good idea to say, I don't like that idea. I'm not going to believe it. Secondly, science itself has lost, as we were just talking about, some of its ability for people to trust. A third area that surprised people about this book was about faith. I'm a person of faith. Faith is for me a way to find another kind of truth, some of those transcendental truths that also can be really important anchors at a stressful time. I'm a Christian, and many of the things that I try to live my life by, that I read about in the words of Jesus, don't seem to necessarily being applied as well as they might right now in our very contentious society where people are quick to assume the worst of each other. That's really not what we were called to do. And then the fourth one was trust. Yeah, maybe, Congressman, if I had to say what's the sort of anchor of all of this, it's how do we decide what information and what sources to trust? And have we gotten a little bit off track there in terms of accepting information from people who happen to be in our bubble that might not be true, but they're in our bubble, so it must be okay? No, that's not a good idea. And rejecting information from people who we see as part of that other bubble that we don't like. And as soon as we start to use that as a filter for what we're going to take on board as our own store of knowledge, we're likely to get skewed into a bad place. And social media is a great amplifier of that problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we really do have a bit of a societal crisis with all this divisiveness. And I don't think it's likely to get better unless we, the people, decide that it's time to take a different approach, to be more careful about information and what we believe and what we don't. And also to stop with this demonizing people who don't agree with us and start to talk to each other again. And that's the last chapter of the Road to Wisdom that I hope people will take to heart.
I'm glad you put it to print because, it is frustrating. It used to be, and like I said, I'm a journalism major. There were certain things that we just all accepted as facts and understood that when you have that as a society, you can make other decisions and move forward. But this has really put us in a spot as a country where we're not able to make the same progress, I feel like. And I'm hoping that we figure out our path out of this. But, with everyone just getting reinforced with the same information from the same sources now, rather than getting other opinions, it does seem more difficult.
And it has casualties, real casualties. The most distressing statistic on the whole horrendous COVID experience is one that was calculated very carefully by Kaiser about what were the consequences of people's decision not to trust the COVID mRNA vaccines after they became widely available to everybody. Their estimate was between June of 2021 and April of 2022, just about 9 months, where vaccines were at that point available to anybody who wanted one for free. About 50 million Americans said no thank you, based upon their sense that they couldn't feel totally trustworthy. And 234,000 of them died as a result of that.
Wow.
That's just an astounding number. That would be during that 9 months, like 3 jumbo jets were crashing every day and killing everybody on board.
Wow.
And this was all preventable
because
we know those vaccines saved 3.1 million Americans, but they could have saved some more. But everything got so tangled up in distrust and misunderstanding and recrimination and polarization, all those words that now seem to describe where we are. We need to figure out how to get back to a better place.
Well, let's focus a little bit on that, because one of the things that we're seeing looking forward is there's some very big cuts proposed to the NIH, both in terms of budget and staffing. This may be an overly obvious question, but why is that bad? What's the real price that we pay for it?
Yeah. Well, let me first say, no organization is perfect. And in my 12 years overseeing NIH as the director, I spent a lot of the time trying to identify ways to make it better. And I did not solve all of the things that needed help. I helped with quite a few of them. But yeah, it's a big organization with like 18,000 employees and almost an equal number of contractors, and a $48 billion budget, and giving all these grants that you cited at the beginning out to all those institutions around the country, making sure that they were done in an appropriate way to do the peer review, judge the excellence. It's complicated. And there's a lot of people, a lot of very dedicated people, I must say. For anyone to say that the NIH was just riddled with lazy bureaucrats would be so far from the truth. And I would hope that anyone who thought that, and some even said it, would have taken the time to actually learn about the realities, because these are some of the most dedicated, exceptional people in the world, most of whom could be doing something much more profitable, but who believe in this mission that we're going to use science to help people. So to basically then come at that with a plan to do major changes, you'd want to do that very carefully. You want to identify, okay, where are areas where some efficiencies could be achieved? Certainly lots of other things are happening around us. Are our data systems as up to speed as they could be? Are we empowering investigators who want to use the latest tools in AI to be able to do that with our data sets? Those are the kind of things you want to work on.
Yeah.
But the strategy that's been taken since January 20th has been very much indiscriminate in terms of the ways in which the budget changes and the personnel changes have been applied without really a consideration about whether those were going to make things better or worse. So, for instance, one of the job cuts was to take anybody who'd only been there for a year and say on Valentine's Day, in a 3-line email, you're fired. People, that was 1,165 people. Those people who just got there within the last year, they're often the people with the new technologies, the new
ideas.
The thing that you most want to be sure you're giving a chance to be heard and to develop into strategies that are going to make the whole thing much more successful. And they're like gone. And wow. And there's also been, I think, a pretty indiscriminate approach to senior leadership. Of the 27 institute directors at NIH, 6 of them have now been dismissed.
Wow.
I can't really see the logic. Almost all of those were people I hired when I was there for 12 years, and they were scientists at the absolute top of their game, but also visionaries and also really good administrators. To have them just suddenly gone with no real plan about how to replace them leaves everything a bit adrift. So morale at NIH, I have to tell you, is at the lowest ebb I've ever seen. People don't know what's coming next. People working in the laboratories at NIH are not allowed to travel. For most of the last 2.5 years, they haven't even been able to order supplies. So you have an experiment that's like really going to give you some interesting feature, but you need to order an enzyme or some cell culture media. And sorry, can't do that right now. And that's causing, I think, a lot of our young scientists, particularly, to get very disheartened. And I'm hearing more and more of them questioning whether this is a field that they're going to be able to stick with or a country they're going to be able to stick with. And certainly some of them have the possibility of moving to another part of the world. This is really hard to watch, just at a time when medical research has been on a total upward trajectory of discovery. And then to have this suddenly slowed down and cut off this way, I didn't see that coming.
Well, and some of it, I talked to researchers at UW-Madison, they explain, for example, stem cell research. If you're not giving it attention every single day, you may lose research that you've been working on for 3 years. And when we have this freezing of funds and unfreezing and chaos, we're taking some real risks, aren't we?
We are indeed. You lose a lot of investment that was already there. There are even instances where clinical trials that have involved people who volunteered to be part of those trials have had to be put on hold, running the risk that no data will come out of that, which is, I think, really unethical for people who have decided they're going to take some chances by being involved in a trial that might involve a new drug that hasn't really been proven successful yet, or even having a device implanted in their body, and then you're sort of left high and dry because of some budgetary decision that says you can't go forward. We shouldn't be doing that to people.
Yeah. Now, I know this is a very particular issue, but I do have people in my district bring it up. So just, one of the latest policies is to cap administrative support for research institutions at 15%. That they're cutting billions in funding for operational and maintenance costs for labs and data systems, staffing. But I'm being told how that is such a thoughtless approach to what's going on. Can you try to, just in very layman's terms, explain why that is a problem?
Yes, I will try. And this is one that I think maybe people have a little bit more trouble understanding. Why are those additional costs built into the NIH grants? Think about it. Somebody wants to do a big new approach to diabetes. And so they're working in their lab in Wisconsin, and maybe they're using induced pluripotent stem cells to try to understand what are the genetic and environmental risk factors that tip somebody over into diabetes or not. That means they're going to have to work in a laboratory that is very high tech. They're going to have certain kinds of shared equipment that other labs may need to use using DNA sequencing. They're going to need to have maybe some robotics to help them. The lights have to be on. the heating and air conditioning has to work. They will need, if they're going to take this forward to a human clinical trial, the ability to have a clinical research unit that can handle that, an institutional review board that will look at the ethics of the proposal. So there's all these other support systems that are necessary for this kind of work to get done. All that support system is not in the grant application or the grant award that investigator got. He's counting, or she's counting on the university to provide that. Universities are unable to do that without some additional help. They're going to tell you already that the cost of accepting an NIH grant requires them to come up with some money, but they're helped because of this additional so-called indirect cost to keep that from being so outrageous that they just couldn't afford to do it. If that number would drop to 15%, a lot of the most productive universities, and I wouldn't be surprised if University of Wisconsin would say this, just can't afford to accept grants anymore because they don't have the deep pockets to be able to cover all these additional costs. And they might have to basically say, we can't do it. And that would be basically sacrificing what has been an amazingly successful American success story that's been in place for decades.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you one more area in, I guess I'd say, the negative turf, and then we're going to end on positive.
That's.
but during the first term of Donald Trump, he made it a goal to end the HIV epidemic in the U.S. by 2030. The priority has fallen by the wayside now in the second Trump administration, with entire HIV departments being fired and dozens of grants terminated just in the last week. Why is this a mistake, given you mentioned that we've made so much progress? Why is this a mistake?
Well, HIV continues to be a serious public health problem across the world and in the United States as well. We still have 25 or 30,000 new cases every year.
Mhm.
Fortunately, the development of antiretroviral drugs means that those people have a chance to live out a pretty full life, but it's very expensive and there are some side effects. Ultimately, we'd like to end this by stopping new cases and coming up with a vaccine. It's been very hard to get that vaccine, but there are promising steps now beginning to appear. The idea that we would step away from this when so many lives are at risk, it does not seem like one that's consistent with the mission of a country that is concerned about all of its citizens. And it's certainly not consistent with NIH's mission. I have to say, since we're talking about HIV, I think also the rest of the world is a place where this is having huge impact. The program at PEPFAR, started by George W. Bush,
Yep.
has saved 26 million lives from people who otherwise would have died of HIV. One of the most remarkable examples of American empathy
Mhm.
and outreach to countries that could not afford to provide this, working intensively with industry to come up with an affordable way to do this. Anybody looking at this has to sort of say to themselves, this is exactly the kind of human beings we should be when we have the ability to do so. And yet that program is also on hold. And there are estimates now that between what's happened to USAID, which was funding a lot of global health efforts, and PEPFAR, as many as 1 or 2 million people may die in the next 12 months if we can't figure out how to get these things back on track.
Yeah.
I don't think you can just shrug your shoulders about something like that. We're very fortunate in this country. We have resources, but those people are our brothers and sisters too. And if we have a chance to help them, again, Matthew 25, I'm a Christian, so I'm thinking a lot about that when Jesus calls us to do something for those who are unclothed and those who are hungry and those who are in prison and those who are sick. And he's watching. And that feels like something that's not left over from the old days. That's true right now. And we should not slip away from that responsibility when we have the chance to help as many people as we can.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, science changes lives. Finding cures for diseases saves lives and improves the quality of
Yes,
life. Um,
yes.
is there a highlight or two during your tenure as the director of NIH you'd like to just share? I mean, I just really would like to make sure we're ending it a bit more positive than.
Yeah, let's. I'll mention two projects that got started while I was NIH director. And again, they were ones where there was sort of an idea and I had the ability to convene a lot of smart people. And then something happened. One is the Brain Initiative,
Mhm.
trying to really figure out how those 86 billion neurons between your ears do what they do. Not
Yeah.
just one at a time, but in these complicated circuits that allow us to do amazing things, but sometimes go awry and cause illnesses like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's or schizophrenia. We haven't really had enough basic understanding of the brain to be able to sort out what happens in neurological diseases, but we could get there. So the Brain Initiative, which is now 10 years along, has recruited not just neurobiologists, but a lot of engineers and developed a lot of technologies that are beginning now to give us in real time a chance to see what circuits are involved when you do something as simple as, lifting your arm
Yeah.
or as complicated as retrieving a memory. And how do we build on that information to help circumstances with people with strokes or with Alzheimer's? That's really exciting. And the horizon is wide open, but it is not going to happen quickly. To have this slowed down right now would be a terrible loss of opportunity. If you care about Alzheimer's disease, you don't want this to go slowly. The other one is something called All of Us. This is my dream and the dream of many people about how we could really figure out how to keep people healthy.
Mhm.
And that means really understanding the mix of your genetic inheritance and your environmental exposures and your health behaviors and your nutrition and what kind of economic situation you're in. But you can't do that just by making it up. You got to have a huge data set.
Mhm.
of people across the country from all kinds of different backgrounds. All of us aimed to enroll 1 million Americans, to have them as full partners, to share their medical records anonymized, to have their genomes completely sequenced, to answer a whole bunch of questionnaires about their daily life, and walk around with wearables that are keeping track of things. We're up to 880,000, so we're getting close.
Nice.
Although I got to say, right now, there's kind of a hold on that because of budget issues. But already, this is turning out to be an absolutely fundamental resource for people who want to ask all kinds of questions about human health. And the people involved are all partners, and they're all willing to be recontacted and take part in follow-up clinical trials or questions of various sorts. This is going to be transformative for a lot of what we want to do about prevention, as well as about management of chronic disease. So that's a good. So we got that. Maybe I'll say one other, because I'm also really excited therapeutically about what's been possible to do with the advent of CRISPR, this
Yes.
amazing way to do gene editing for those thousands of genetic diseases where we know the DNA misspelling, but we haven't really had a treatment. And of course, this began in a big way with sickle cell disease, the most widely known and the original molecular disease due to just one misspelled letter out of 3 billion. And now, with this gene therapy, CRISPR based, people with sickle cell disease are getting cured.
Yeah.
With an FDA approved approach. And those other 7,000 diseases that are of the same sort have hopes that they might be possibly reached in the same way in the next decade. And that could be enormously gratifying. Every one of those diseases is a heartache and a heartbreak for a family where it's occurring. And it's often a child that needs this kind of intervention. We could do this. That's something I really believe in.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask. Because I again, as someone who it does not have a science background, but CRISPR has been, without question, one of the most significant things in my lifetime that we've seen progress in. So, so if a member of Congress who maybe doesn't share some of your and my values most directly, we're here in front of you right now. What would you say to them before they go to make the next budget or to make any more cuts? What do you think is the most compelling thing that you would like to say?
Oh, I'd want to start with the conversation, because we need to do more of that. And I guess I would ask, tell me about your own health concerns and those of your family. What are the things that you're not sure about? What are the things that actually are going pretty well? Let me understand how, from your view, health plays a role in your daily experience with your friends, with your constituents. And invariably, people will say, well, my sister-in-law right now just got a diagnosis of breast cancer, and we're all kind of worried. And then sort of get into, okay, understand that that's an issue. How are we as a nation going to address that even more effectively than what's possible right now? Let's talk about how that works, because oftentimes it's not that clear. It's like, well, I need a company to come up with a new drug for my sister-in-law's breast cancer. Well, okay, that it would be a good thing, but how are they going to get there? They're going to have to depend on fundamental knowledge, and that's coming maybe from a university right in your state, but the funding for that is coming from NIH. And just sort of walk through that, because it's a very compelling story. You can't really be opposed to what NIH does once you understand it. You can always say it could be better, as we talked about earlier, but you can't say, it's irrelevant. We don't need those people and we don't need that mission. If we care about our families and our future children and all the rest, we gotta put the effort into making this succeed.
So 345 of, am I saying that right? Of 346 drugs that came to market between 2012 and 2021. I'm going to remember that number now. So I appreciate that. Anything else, Dr. Collins, you'd like to mention to our listeners before we wrap up?
Well, I also think we need to pay attention to infectious disease. We obviously went through a terribly wrenching time with COVID. It will be seen, I think, historically as one of the most major achievements of science to have developed in just 11 months vaccines that were 95% effective in treating and keeping people out of the hospital and keeping them from dying. And that had never been done in less than 5 years. But at the same time, as we talked about, we got into a circumstance where there was a lot of distrust about that rather miraculous outcome. And this is not the last pandemic. I
Right.
wish
Yeah.
I wish we didn't have to think about that, but we do. And I don't know what the next one will be, whether it's going to be influenza and we're all worried about H5N1 or some other coronavirus or something. And I think science learned a lot of lessons from COVID. We could maybe even go faster developing a vaccine the next time.
Mhm.
But the support for all of that pandemic preparedness, which everybody was determined we're not going to go into complacency this time, well, we kind of have.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the preparations that you would want to be having happen right now mostly aren't. And that's something to think about.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thank you for raising that. So besides your book, Road to Wisdom, how else can people follow you and your work? Because again, you've had such a body of work, and I really, I am very fortunate in the job I have because I get a chance to meet people like you and talk to people like you, and more importantly, learn a little because there's so much out there to learn. But how can people follow you?
Well, I have a website, which is francisscollins.com. Not just Francis Collins. Somebody else owns that. They don't want to give it to me. So it's
Gotcha.
Francis S., that's my middle initial, Collins.com. And that has a whole bunch of recent media things that I've done in podcasts. I will put this one up there once it posts
Good, good.
as well, and various media things. And mostly right now, I am trying to figure out how I can be helpful in continuing this effort to improve the health of the nation, even at a difficult time. And I appreciate the chance to talk to you about that. I do believe Americans, as Winston Churchill famously once said, you can always count on them to do the right thing
Mhm.
after they exhaust all the other options.
Right. That might be the most positive way to end the program. And again, thank you. You really you are a national hero. Thank you so much for all the work you've done and you continue to do. And I appreciate your time today.
Appreciate being with you, Congressman. Thanks for your leadership on the Hill.
Yep,
May we get through this and come out the other side of it as a better people.
we will. I can tell you just from watching people, recently in Wisconsin speaking out through an election, people care, and they came out at record levels, and that's what gives me the ability to get up every morning. I'll be honest. So, um,
Good.
yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being with us.